Lovely. Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here today. You already heard, I have the pleasure of being the in-house futurist at the American Alliance of Museums, which is the National Museum Association in America. It's a very interesting job because I'm charged with helping museum people think about how the world will be different in 10 years, 25 years, 50 years, so that they can help their communities navigate the challenges that are coming down the road. And it is a little bit challenging because it requires helping museum people who usually spend a lot of their time thinking about the past, helping them pivot to think about the future, from how things have happened to things that might happen but haven't happened yet. It's not too hard, however, because the talents that one needs as a futurist are talents that museum people tend to have: creativity, imagination, a sense of play. But it does require some changes. I have to help people alter what they pay attention to, where they spend their time thinking, what they notice in the world. And I also have to help them make a change in their intention, what it is they want to change as a result of their work. I'm hoping that in my talk to you today, I will convince you to make a change in the intention of your work, because I'm hoping to help you understand how, while museums have traditionally been keepers of the past, we've traditionally been stewards of helping people understand how the world has changed, how animals have evolved, how human history has played out over time, to thinking of ourselves as keepers of the future. How can we help people intentionally shape the way they want the world to change? To do this, I'm going to offer you a meditation in 3 parts. And to frame my meditation, I've chosen a triptych, an illustration of the Earth. These photographs were taken by the Juno mission to Jupiter, which was launched in 2011. 2 years later, it did a flyby of the Earth and took these beautiful photographs. So I'm going to use that as framing for the 3 points I want to make of what museums need to do in order to become keepers of the future. First of all, we have to learn how to detoxify the past, how to remove poisons from the system. Secondly, we need to learn how to use a clicker. We need to learn to tell true stories about things that haven't happened yet. And this is the key skill of futurism, helping people think about stories that may become true in the future. And last of all, we have to decolonize that future. We have to cease exploiting resources in a way that increase inequity in the world. So let me start by thinking about how you detoxify the past. And I'm going to do that by introducing one of the key frameworks futurists use to think about what may happen that hasn't happened yet. And this is a wonderful diagram called the Cone of Plausibility. The Cone of Plausibility basically maintains that back here at this point in the time, the present, we know what the world's like. Or we could know what the world's like if we go out and look. Tomorrow, probably going to be more or less like today, absent a huge transformative change, like a volcanic eruption. Krakatoa happens. Maybe the world could change overnight. But as time plays out, the limits of what could happen diverge. And more things that seem impossible or implausible today become plausible, are encompassed by what might happen. So, for example, I remember back in my first museum job, back in the 90s, the husband of our director of development came in, and he had this amazing device. He was carrying a portable phone. It was as big as a brick and about as heavy as one. Back then, I think people would have been amazed to imagine that this was a cell phone. And now it's become an everyday commonplace object. So that's firmly in the bounds of the plausible now. Maybe in 50 years, somewhere in the boundaries of plausibility, instead of carrying an object like that, it will be hardwired into my brain. Could happen. Right now, we're beginning to see that we have the ability to alter our own genes through gene editing like CRISPR. There's a scientist in China who, without permission, altered the genes of a baby, hoping that it would become resistant to HIV. He may have unintentionally done a lot of other things, so people are very concerned about this, but it shows that gene editing of the human body is beginning to be possible. Maybe in 50 years, within that cone of plausibility, it could be normal for parents to go in and say, we want to have a baby with, let's see, red hair and blue eyes and over 6 feet tall, because I'd like this baby to be able to play basketball. Male or female? Let's leave that ambiguous. We want a baby who's intersex. Could happen. What futurists sometimes don't take the time to step back and think about is the fact that that cone of plausibility really works in both directions. Standing here in the present, we often think we know what happened in the past from our study of history or paleontology. But the fact is, the farther back you go in time, the less certain we are about what really happened. Sometimes this is a matter of what is missing from the record. In paleontology, you may be missing a key fossil. You might not know what the intermediate biological form was between this animal and that animal. In history, we may have lost key documents so that we don't have a record of what happens at a certain point in the past. But the other reason that there is such a wide cone of plausibility about the past is the imperfections of our memory. Because we either intentionally or unintentionally forget what happened, or we selectively remember and shape the memory of what happened in ways that may be inaccurate. This is important for museums because we play a key role in what gets remembered, what gets forgotten, and what gets misremembered. And this is why we have a responsibility to try and detoxify the past when that historical record has not been accurate. I'm going to offer several examples of how museums are actually beginning to do this work of detoxification. So my first example is from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, favorite of mine. My training is in biology. This is a classic diorama. It was built in 1939, and it depicts an imagined meeting that probably took place back in the 17th century between Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor, the colonial governor of New Amsterdam, as New York was then known, and leaders of the Native American tribes that lived in that area called the Lenape Indians. So, over the decades, tens of thousands of New York school children came and saw this diorama, and it shaped their understanding of the history of New York City and of American Indians. That's a problem, because it is profoundly inaccurate in many ways. For one thing, the Lenape sending a delegation to meet with the colonial governor almost certainly would have dressed in inappropriate regalia to show the solemnity of the occasion. And that delegation probably would have included women leaders, who in this diorama you will notice are in the background half-naked carrying burdens. There also would have been canoes out on the ocean, not just the Western ships, because Native Americans knew how to get out on the ocean. But most profoundly, the way this diorama was created, and this is true of many, many exhibits about Native Americans in American museums, gave the impression that the Lenape were a thing of the past, that they didn't exist anymore, that they were extinct, that it was a dead culture, when in fact they are very much a living culture who live in modern-day New York. So the American Museum of Natural History was faced with a dilemma. What do they do to correct the inaccuracy of memory they'd created? They could have torn the diorama out, but they decided that would be wrong because it's important to also remember how we have misremembered the past. So what they did instead is they worked with a Native American historian to literally layer new interpretation on top of the diorama. They created clear overlays that they put on the glass to have people looking at the scene notice things that were wrong and what those inaccuracies said about the attitudes of people in 1939 when they created the diorama. So it's both an opportunity to correct those inaccuracies and invite people to reflect on the ways that people had imposed those misperceptions on Native Americans for hundreds of years, in this case, past 100 years. The next error of representation is who is actually represented. So our first example were stories that were told in an inaccurate way. The next category is the question of who is represented in our museums at all. This is a diagram of who is represented as artists in American art museums. And the vast majority of art in American museums is by, big surprise, white men. And then you can see in the other circles the smaller representations in pink of white women and non-white artists, Latino, Asian, all others. Needless to say, this is not an accurate reflection of artists who are actually out there. So, if we have this legacy in our collections of who's not even in that collection, how do we correct that? Well, I'm going to give you 3 examples. One, an example of one museum trying to shift perception. One example of a museum taking action to change that reality. And one national movement through a nonprofit foundation to try and change practice in a systemic way. So my first example is from the National Museum of Women in the Arts in my hometown of Washington, D.C. 3 years ago, they started a social media campaign called 5 Women Artists. So it's a hashtag on Twitter or on Facebook, 5 Women Artists, and they challenged people simply, can you name 5 women artists? Think about it a moment. You're art people, you probably can. But the fact is most people can't. I found it challenging, and then I realized I couldn't spell half of the ones that I could remember. So they launched this social media campaign just to raise awareness of how many people weren't knowledgeable about women in art. And this social media campaign reached 1,500 cultural institutions in 54 countries in 7 continents. So they did this 3 years, 2016 to 2019. Next year, they're going to try and shift from awareness to action. So they've put out a challenge to museums to sign a pledge. And they can pledge to do one of 3 things. They can either pledge that the next time they change out the permanent collections on display in their museum, they will change it to reflect a higher proportion of women. They can pledge that in the next year, they will acquire one major work by a woman artist. Or they can pledge that over the next 5 years in their temporary exhibit schedule, they will have gender equity of the artists represented on exhibit. So here's an example of one museum trying to change representation in museums across the world. But how do you do that? How do you make such a profound change when you're so constrained by what you've inherited by the people who built the museum? Here's an example. The Baltimore Museum of Art in Baltimore, Maryland, looked at their collections and said, yes, you're right, we're profoundly overrepresented in white male artists. We have a great collection. We're going to pick works by 5 famous male artists, including Andy Warhol and Rauschenberg, and we're going to sell them. And we're going to use the $12 million we got from that sale to buy women artists and works by underrepresented artists. So we're going to diversify our collection by selling work by major mainstream male artists to have the capacity to buy new works that are more representative of our community. 9 years ago, a collector named William Arnett, who had spent his life collecting African American art from the Deep South, folk artists, underrepresented artists, started a nonprofit foundation called Souls Grown Deep. And he gifted to that foundation all 1,300 works that he had collected over his lifetime, along with a generous endowment to allow it to operate. They wanted to change this question of underrepresentation and underrecognition of African American artists. So they started, first of all, by sending works from that collection on tour all over the US, saying, will you host an exhibit about this artist that probably no one in your audience has heard of? Then second, they started designing and touring exhibits that represented those artists in the context of the established canon, saying, this artist is working in the same tradition as this other white male artist you're familiar with. They are contemporaries. They are equals. How can we change the canon of how art history is taught? And then the third step that they're now taking is they're selling collections from this collection. They're selling works of art to selected museums to say, let us help you diversify your collections. Let's make sure you have works in your collection that you can regularly exhibit to change the narrative you tell. So this is a foundation that is trying to make systemic change throughout museums in North America. This correction of the historical record is important because museums are among the most trusted institutions of any in society. Global surveys, national surveys in the US, show that museums in general are more trusted as a source of information than government, even than traditional news outlets, more than researchers. But if we're going to retain that trust and be able to use it to shape society, we have to acknowledge what we've done wrong in the past and correct it through actions like this. Once we have done that, from a position of having acknowledged what we've done wrong and that we're making good faith efforts to correct it, we can start addressing other inequities such as who has the power and resources to shape their own stories. The fact is, often the history of museums has been about taking power from one set of people and bringing it into the museum. For example, Britain looted Benin in 1897. You may be familiar with the report that came out of France last year, the Macron report by Sarr, that looked at the art of sub-Saharan Africa that existed in French collections. That report concluded that somewhere between 90 to 95% of the art, the cultural artifacts, the cultural heritage of sub-Saharan Africa, now resided outside sub-Saharan Africa in Western museums because of looting such as this. Now, that report recommended that countries like France begin to repatriate these collections, to give the collections back to the countries where it originated so that the youth of those countries had ownership and control over their own heritage. In some countries, this is complicated by the fact that there are national regulations about what you can and can't do with collections and museums that are mostly run by the government. In North America, that's not so often true. The majority of museums in North America are private nonprofits. They aren't subject to direct government regulations about, for example, what they can do with their collections. Now, there may be a lot of inhibitions about what they can do, but it is under their control. So here's an example of one museum, the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in Rhode Island, identified that in their own collection they did own a Benin bronze. It depicted an Oba, a traditional leader, the king of Benin, and they had acquired it from a donor in 1939 who had himself bought it from a dealer in the early 1930s. The provenance was very murky. They couldn't track back exactly who had bought it from whom and where it had come from, but they concluded it was undoubtedly looted, probably during the British punitive expeditions. So they knew that whether or not it had technically legally been obtained, it was not ethically obtained. So they decided that they would take the action of repatriating it back to Benin. It's actually turned out to be more complicated because it's not quite clear who you give it back to. You know, there's the country of Nigeria, there's the royal court of Benin, so they're trying to decide now who is the appropriate steward to transfer it to, but they've decided to take that action. After we have taken these actions to detoxify the past and shown that we are trustworthy stewards of that past, we can begin to help people think about the future. One of the things that futurists do is they help people tell stories about things that haven't happened yet, but could. And really, this is the art of all good fiction. So let's take a look again at that cone of plausibility. And this time I have populated the cone with some little circles that represent what futurists call scenarios. These are basically stories of the future, things that could happen. If you think of your own favorite fiction, you probably can think of examples of utopian fiction that describe the world as one author would like it to be. It's much more common to see dystopian fiction because writing dark futures is fun. So stories of how the world could go to hell in all sorts of ways. But as we think about these stories, there are various ways to categorize them. In the center of the cone are what we tend to think is the probable future. If things just keep going exactly like they're going today and nothing disrupts it, that's where we'll end up. That hardly ever happens. Usually there's some disruption that knocks us off course, and we might end up in some wild scenario that you never could have seen coming. But there are many different ways the world could play out. Some of them we might think about and say, that's a dark future, we hope we don't go there. This is a bright future, that's the future I'd like to build. This is the kind of thinking people need to do to understand that the future is not inevitable, that we can help influence it, and that we can take actions that steer us towards a bright future that we'd like to live in and away from dark futures that we would not like to live in. Telling stories is one thing. Even better than telling stories is illustrating them in the real world. And here's a beautiful little example. Last year, an artist named Thomas Starr started putting up these little markers around the states of New Hampshire and Massachusetts. These were like historical markers. You know, you're walking through a historic district, there's a little plaque that says, on this date in such and such a year, so-and-so did this, right? Same thing, except these are fictional markers that talk about future events as if they had already happened. So, for example, he put this little marker up outside a boathouse at the University of New Hampshire, and it's dated 2057. So it's a historical marker about 2057, a date in the past, saying there used to be a little structure, a gazebo here, but it had to be relocated because of rising sea levels. That's a genius little installation, because if you're a student and you're walking along and you read this, you'll suddenly reflect, oh wow, of course I've heard of climate change, and I know that the seas are going to rise, but I didn't realize this area I'm on now is going to be underwater. Little piece of fiction that you can see that makes you think about the world in a different way. So that's a small physical piece of climate fiction. Here's a bigger example. This is an exhibit that's part of a project going on in Sweden now called Climaginaries, helping people use their imagination to think about climate futures. And Climaginaries imagined that in the year 2054, Sweden would open a new museum called Fossil, talking about the history of how we got to the point where Sweden in the year 2045 became carbon neutral. How wonderful, because carbon neutrality is going to be the key to fighting climate change. And 5 years later, in the year 2050, the rest of the world followed Sweden's example and became carbon neutral. So this imaginary museum is filled with exhibits of obsolete artifacts, like these frequent flyer mile cards. Can you imagine a time when people used to fly so much they actually had little cards showing that they flew? This is a beautiful example of what people call climate positivism. We get so much depressing news about, oh, we're going to be living in a world that's too hot to bear, and my community is going to be underwater because of rising sea levels. And it tends to lead to a feeling of hopelessness. If you show people potential bright futures in which we've solved that problem, it can help inspire them to take action and not tune out the bad news. Well, these are beautiful examples of fictional exhibits out in the world, but the fact is there are many real museums today who are helping people think about the future in ways that inspire people to take action. And I'm going to share 3 examples. One is the Museum of the City of New York. One is at the Museum, which is a children's museum in San Antonio, Texas. And one is a whole museum devoted to thinking about the future in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, called the Museum of Tomorrow. So let's see how each of these museums help people tell stories about things that haven't happened yet. At the Museum of the City of New York, they have part of an exhibit called the Future City Lab, where they help people think about how New York is changing because of demographics, because of the economy, because of climate change. And as one of the pieces of that Futures Lab, they let people ask their own question. I love this example because so much of what you see in museums nowadays is about technology, projection systems, and augmented and artificial reality. And some museums say, oh, we can't afford to do that. How about this for simplicity? They put out little cards with a prompt at the top that says, what if? And then they let people fill in the rest of that question. And people ask their own questions. In this case, what if everybody voted? Now, I don't know what it's like in Finland, but in the US, voter turnout is very low. In the 2016 election, only about 64% of the eligible voters voted. Had that been higher, we might not have the president we have today. Think about that. Another question somebody asked is, what if there was a universal basic income? Now, one of the sayings of futurism is the future is unequally distributed. It's already here, it's just unequally distributed. In this case, I think the future reached Finland a little earlier than it reached the US, because you've already been playing with universal basic income, yes? So this person in New York said, what if we had universal basic income here? So then the museum looks through all of these hundreds of cards that people post in the exhibit. They pick a few, they put them up on the website, and they invite people to respond, starting these long conversations, answering that question, what if? What if everyone voted? Would somebody else be in the White House today? How would politics be different if more underrepresented groups, if more young people voted, if more people who are traditionally have voter suppression happening in their communities were registered and voted? How would the world be different? How would universal basic income change your life? Great simple prompt to get people thinking about how things could be different. My next example is from the Museum in San Antonio, Texas. San Antonio, last year, was 300 years old. That may not sound much to Europeans, but in the US it's a big deal. That's a very old city. So they said, to celebrate our 300th birthday, we're going to think of an exhibit to help kids learn how to be future thinkers. And full disclosure, they had me come in and help them with the charrette to design this exhibit. And the result was an exhibit called Dream Tomorrow Today. And they thought of ways of helping little children think about 300 years in the future. What did they want San Antonio to be like when they grew up, when they had children, when they had grandchildren? As one of the exercises, they had a virtual reality, augmented reality game where kids could design the city of the future and say, I want my San Antonio of the future to look like this. And then just to make it really fun, after a child designed their own city, the game would have a giant storm come in and try and destroy it, and would give them a resiliency score. It's like, yay, you survived, yes! Oh, not so good, the city's underwater. Maybe that didn't work. The last example I want to share is the Museum of Tomorrow in Brazil. So this opened in 2010, and it does start with history, that cone of looking backwards, asking, how did mankind get to where we are today? what is the world today like, but then the focus of the museum is looking forward 50 years to what will Brazil be like in 50 years. What are the forces shaping us now? What is increasing urbanism doing? What is the environmental degradation of the rainforest doing? And they do a lot of interactives with the visitors, a lot of digital interactives, and as you go through the museum, you have a little card, and as you use these interactives, you put the card in, you play with the computer game, you find the information, you take your card out. So by the time you get to the end of the museum, this card has a whole history, looking at the exhibits, knowing how you've interacted with them. And what the museum did was a few years ago, they created an artificial intelligent chatbot named Iris Plus. Iris is an AI chatbot that talks to visitors, reads their cards, and asks them questions. Now, this is interesting because chatbots usually answer questions. Hello, customer service, my computer's not working, how do I fix it? You may not even know you're talking to an AI intelligence that's answering your question. But Iris interviews people and says, so what do you think? Out of all of these forces that you learned about going through the exhibits, which one worries you the most? And somebody might say, well, you know, I'm really worried about the fact that my children aren't getting a good education. I'm worried about the public schools. And Iris would say, you know, I can see from your demographic information you provided that this is the neighborhood you live in. There are several organizations in your neighborhood working to improve education. Maybe you would like to volunteer with one of them and become active. So Iris, by talking to the visitors, helps draw out what they think is the thing they're most worried about that they would like to improve, and then gives suggestions. Here's a concrete thing you could go back and do in your community to make that better. Very direct connection between helping people envision what could happen in the future and the actions they could take today to make it better. All right. Those are both challenging activities. Extremely challenging, both changing the stories we tell as museums, ensuring that we're representing people equitably, that we're giving them power to tell their own stories, and figuring out how to help people think about how the future could be different and what they could do to influence that. But perhaps the hardest challenge of all is decolonizing that future before it happens. What do I mean by that? Many of the protests you'll see today about decolonization are talking about the ways in which our current wealth has been taken through the theft of labor, the theft of resources, often from indigenous people or other countries. So basically building our wealth from things taken from other people. I would contend that another way to look at this is much of the wealth we're building today is stolen from the future. We're making decisions as organizations, as institutions, as governments, that may look like very good decisions in the short term, very profitable decisions that make things better for us. But it's dumping all of the costs of those decisions on future generations and stealing the options that they will no longer have. So, for example, there's an estimate that within the next 10 years, there will be a total of 250 million metric tons of plastic in the ocean. That's something like 1 pound of plastic for every 3 pounds of fish. That's amazing. How did we get there? What kind of mindset creates a world that is so profoundly polluted that leaves a future like this to our children to clean up? Well, there's a wonderful quote by the founder of the Empathy Museum, whose name is Roman Krznaric. He said, "We treat the future like a distant colonial outpost, devoid of people, where we can freely dump ecological degradation, technological risk, nuclear waste, and public debt, and that we feel at liberty to plunder as we please." The kinds of decisions that we already messed up the world with physically, we're using to compound the future that we're leaving to our children. Well, we're still trying to figure out how to decolonize the present, how to undo the practices and make reparations for the things that we've exploited from other cultures. What would it look like to decolonize the future? What does it look like to make decisions that are taking into account the interests of future generations and not just works for us in the present? Often museums get a pass as being the good guys. You know, you might think that corporations, big corporations, are evil, so we suspect what they're doing. Or governments, there may be skepticism about whether they're really making decisions in the best interest of the people. Museums, as I said, are highly trusted. Usually people think we get these things right. So I want to start with the inverse of what does it look like when museums make decisions that aren't in the best interest of future generations? What does it look like when museums engage in what I might call presentism, just thinking about how to get through the next few years? This is great. Usually when I'm speaking in the US, I have to use examples of bad behavior from Europe. So since I'm in your country, I get to use examples of bad behavior from the US. I can't say this when I'm at home. Okay. So context. This is a map of the Gulf Coast of the US. So over to the right, we have Florida. Over to the left, we have Texas. New Orleans, you've probably heard of, is right about here. And I want to talk about a little community called Biloxi, Mississippi, which is right about there. Now, what is this map showing? The pink zone is a 100-kilometer corridor from the ocean, right? That is at greater risk of storm damage, and in the next coming decades from rising seas. The red is areas that are at very high risk in coming decades from severe storms and rising seas. The blue dots are museums. And the fact is, in the US, about 1/3 of all museums in the country are within 100 kilometers of a coast. And 1/4 of museums are in an area of the coast that is at a high coastal storm index risk, right? So the severe risk from storms. One might think, if you were a museum in this zone, you'd be thinking about what to do in the long run. Most of us say that we care for our collections in perpetuity, right? I've yet to find a museum that would tell me how long perpetuity is, you know, but I'm figuring it's at least a couple hundred years, right? So if you were going to raise millions of dollars to build a new building, you'd think you'd want it to be storm resistant, right? There's a little museum in Biloxi, Mississippi called the Orr O'Keefe Museum. It's a pottery museum that collects the works of George Orr, the mad potter of Biloxi. We won't go into all the ways he was mad, very colorful character. But they decided that his work deserved a brand new museum, and they raised $54 million to build it. One of the reasons it was so expensive is they were having it designed by Frank Gehry, king of architects who have their projects go 120% over budget. But still, you know, it was a beautiful design. But they decided to put it right on the property they already owned, which I kid you not is 200 yards from the ocean. You may have heard of Hurricane Katrina. That is the site of the new museum. This is a casino barge that was picked up and dropped on the site of the new museum by Hurricane Katrina. This was a bad decision. If you're going to spend $54 million to build a new building on coastal Mississippi, maybe you should be spending that money helping your community think about whether in the long run everyone's going to have to migrate inland and what it would look like to be storm resilient as a community, much less as a museum. Hindsight's 20/20, okay, but I would argue that that was a foreseeable bad risk. Often the stories of bad decisions have to do with capital campaigns, because that tends to be when museums amass a lot of money that they're going to spend in a good way or a bad way. Often the other thing that involves really bad long-term decisions is collections, because that's the other big asset museums own. So here's another story of a bad decision, I would argue, from the US. Delaware is a small state just north of Washington, D.C., and the Delaware Museum of Art in about 2005 decided the best thing they could do is build an expansion. It is amazing how often museum boards conclude that that's the best thing a museum can do, even though there's very good data that shows if you build it, they will come, doesn't usually work. You know the museum that Frank Gehry designed in Bilbao? I hate it if only because it created the misperception that if you build a gorgeous new building, people will flock to it from around the world. It usually doesn't work. So the Delaware Museum of Art borrowed like $50 million through something called a bond to finance this new building. Guess what? 10 years later, it wasn't working out. It wasn't that they miraculously had more people coming through the door and giving them more money so that they could pay for it. They were in debt. So they decided that the only way they could get out of debt was to sell some of the collections to private collectors. Got about $40 million to help pay off the debt. So I would argue, again, presentism. First of all, back up to the 2005 decision, thinking about the long term. If you're going to get that many $1 million to invest for your community, maybe a new building isn't the best thing. And secondly, now to bail yourself out of being in debt, you're taking works of art that you are holding in the public trust and selling them to try and solve your financial problem. So now those works are not available to future generations. And in fact, it doesn't solve their financial problem anyway, it just bailed them out in the short term. But there are lots of good examples of museums making decisions that are thinking forward, that are thinking about the needs of future generations. Now, one thing you can do is you can think about what will future generations want you to collect. That might be tangible culture, it may be intangible culture. So, for example, in Alaska, the Alutiiq Museum, which is founded and run by Native Americans, decided that the most important thing they could preserve for the future is language. In 1981, there were only 900 native speakers of Alutiiq left. The most recent survey is there may be 45 people in all of Alaska who speak Alutiiq on a daily basis. So the museum has made it a core activity to work with other organizations in the community and with schools to document the language and then to teach young people to speak it as a living language. This is an example of one of their activities. They have a word of the day up on their website where you can go in and hear a native speaker explaining a word and pronouncing it. This is Eliahaskach, chipped one, referring to chipped stone tools. So this is a museum preserving a whole language which embodies a culture for the next generation. Another example, thinking broadly about fostering sustainability. Not just what you're doing in the museum to present your works of art or whatever your mission is about, but operating in a way that makes the world a sustainable place. I can think of no better example than the Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is their new sustainable landscape center. So first of all, as a botanic garden, they decided to create a center teaching people how to plant their yards and gardens in a sustainable way with native plants in ways that won't use excess water. But this museum does everything they do with an eye to sustainability. So, for example, in their food service, they only serve locally raised food, and they try and serve healthy food to help children and families learn how to eat in a way that doesn't promote obesity. They don't use any plastic water bottles. They encourage people to buy refillable bottles, and they have water stations throughout the museum. The other thing they do is they take their endowment, their fund of money that they draw on for their operations, and they invest their endowment only in companies that operate in ways that support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So they say, yeah, if you just dump your endowment into standard investment funds, you might be investing in oil companies, you might be investing in tobacco companies, you might be investing in tech companies that are doing things that we feel are not green or sustainable. They're saying, let's be ethical investors. When we invest our money, we're going to choose companies that make the world a better place. So here's a museum that in every aspect of its operation says, what are the ripple effects through time of that decision we're making? And last, one of the most profound things museums can do to combat temporal colonialism is to give future generations a voice in today's decision-making. In the US, this is often done by having youth advisory councils, by recruiting young people and giving them a formal role in the museum that grants them some voice and some authority. Maybe it's decision-making about programming. Maybe it's asking their opinion on certain policy issues. There's one museum in the US, the Climate Museum in New York City, that recruited a youth advisory council of people ages 14 to 19 that not only helped them design their exhibits, but they lend those young people their authority and their reputation to go out in the world and take action. So, for example, here is their youth advisory council marching in the 2018 zero-hour march against climate change. The informal motto of my center at the Alliance is, museums can change the world. And usually when I put this up on the screen at a talk, everybody feels great. Sometimes they'll even go, yay, or applaud, because they love the thought that museums are that powerful. The longer I do this work, the more cynical I get, because of course museums can change the world. There are a lot of us, and we have a lot of power of authority. We have people's trust. We have immense reserves of resources, whether it's the money that we control or the knowledge and authority of the people who work for us, the depth of our collections. The question isn't whether or not museums can change the world. The question is, how will we choose to change the world? Because everything we do, what we choose to collect, what we choose to exhibit, how we choose to give people voice and authority, whether we think about future generations when we're making our decisions, is going to help create the kind of world we live in. And I hope that going forward from today, when you go back to your daily work, when you go back to your job in a museum or working with museums or doing research about museums, you spend some time thinking about what kind of world you want to live in, what kind of world you want to leave to your children and grandchildren. And with every decision you make about the museum's actions, how can you think about choosing what will take us a little bit towards that brighter future? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was spot on and wonderful. So we are really happy to have this opportunity. And there's also some time for discussions. And I really look forward to hearing your comments on Elizabeth's talk. So if you want to make a comment from the audience, please raise your hand and we have a microphone circulating. I'm sorry, I need to do this in order to spot you. Maybe a question from there. Yes, Riitta.
Thank you. I'm Riitta from the Finnish National Gallery. And I was thinking about the collections because I'm director of collections management and the idea of detoxicating. So do you think that collections, you were talking about detoxicating the past, but can one or should one really detoxicate the collections?
Thank you. So the answer is, I think, yes, but sometimes it's harder than others because collections can be toxic in so many ways. Sometimes it's the object itself. So, for example, in America, one of the things we struggle with are artifacts from the Civil War, especially artifacts that are inherently very hurtful, to African Americans, people whose ancestors were enslaved. So how do you preserve that in a way that is respectful and try and show it in a context where some people in America still look at those objects and use it to remember a glorified past and to justify their racism or their view of history. But some of it is about how we even talk about collections. And I know there are many museums that are starting to go back and look at the language they use to describe an object. Some museums are even renaming works of art, saying, well, this might have been described with a word that is now considered racist or inflammatory, so we're going to be more neutral. Or it may have been described with a word that ignored the personhood, like Lady Elizabeth de Bourges and a slave. Great. That person is relegated to being and a slave. So now maybe they would describe this as, identifying where that person was from or whatever you can know about who they were and recognizing their personhood. So it's difficult. It's difficult. And I know in the US a lot of it has come down to trying to have a lot more people involved in giving you input about how they feel about the way that you're collecting, exhibiting, or talking about the collections.
Thank you. Other comments? Kimmo, do you have another mic on this side, or there is a comment there, and then let's take Katrina first if there is no mic on that side.
So, hello, really interesting talk. Thank you. I am Katrina Siivonen from University of Turku, Finland Futures Research Center. And I would like to, I'm thinking about this decolonizing part, and then your last, this sentence about how would museum professionals would like to change the world. But how do you see the role of this kind of participatory futures research methods in museum work? So
the role of participatory methods, did you say?
Participatory future studies methods in museum work, so, and in combination of decolonizing.
Mm-hmm. Personally, one of my ambitions is to try and help every person working in a museum to be a little bit of a futurist, because I think an awareness of how your actions today can change the future will change a lot of everyday actions that people may just do as a matter of course or a matter of habit now without questioning why they do it or the effects it's had on the world. I generally find that when I bring futures methodology into a museum, it helps people question assumptions and think about new ways of practice. So they go from, in America, there's an obsession about benchmarking. Who else is doing this and how do they do it? Which is a great thing to know, but it doesn't mean you should all do it that way. It just means most people are doing it that way. And I think one of the nice things about teaching a little bit of futures thinking and the methodology of looking at trends and looking about long-term effects is it can help museums have the courage to break away from tradition and be comfortable doing something else other than what everybody else is doing.
But I would like to still enlarge this not only to museum personnels, but different human beings in the society, different communities, how to co-work with them with participatory future studies methods.
Yes. And I think that's the genius of some of the museums I pointed to as examples, is when they're introducing this into their exhibit and planning work, it's not just telling, it's asking. It's giving people in the community and visitors a framework for giving input. Some museums I know have really made this a basis for how they operate. So, for example, Museum of Fine Arts in San Angelo Museum of Fine Arts, run by a museum director who's a little bit of a futurist himself. His name is Howard Taylor. Every year they run some kind of futures forum where they invite the community in to say, this is what we want San Angelo to look like. And some of it's long-term futures, but some of it's short-term futures. You know, what should we do with this piece of undeveloped land? Which historic structures should we conserve and what should be done with them? So I think one of the beautiful things about museums is they have the standing and the power and place and authority that when people come in and voice those opinions, they can help then influence the decision makers. So I think we become mediators between people and their wishes and their values and imagination and the people who actually control those resources, like governments.
My name is Kimmo Antila, coming from Finnish Postal Museum. Thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation. And this emphasis on how every decision matters. I mean, an important issue about the decolonization, the future. So we all know that we are facing huge challenges right now and in the future. And going beyond the museum's role, I would also like to discuss about the workers in the museum and about the museum activism, which is actually currently quite a topic in Europe. I mean, I think a couple of weeks ago I was speaking to my colleagues in Transport and Communication Museum, and we discussed about what Greta Thunberg would ask to us, or would he be as angry to museum people as she is for the world leaders? Mm-hmm. Are we doing enough? Are we just still consuming a lot of energy talking about new immersive exhibitions and well, we are discussing about sustainability here, but are we actually doing enough? Should we go out on the streets? Should we really keep in mind that all these profound values that we are sharing in the museums and do actively something in society, not just in the museum, but also as a human beings in this planet?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Museums' role as activists. There's a movement in the US right now that calls itself Museums Are Not Neutral. And their premise is that in the past, museums claimed a status as being neutral experts. You know, we have no opinion, we're just presenting the facts. And they challenged museums to acknowledge that just the facts themselves by what you selected was taking a stand, even if it was just a stand to support the status quo. And it was only seen as neutral because it was going with what the majority expected to see. So the question became, if you're going to take a stand, whether it's about something like climate activism, or whether it's, for example, in the US, against mass incarceration. We have one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world, and how is it affecting our society? Or whether it's taking a stand about wealth inequality, and which requires examining what you're paying your workers, as well as the ripple effects of how you're doing business in the world. And at least in the US, one of the struggles is, how does one organization, and let's limit it to museums, which are mission-driven right now, choose what to take a stand about? There are 1,000 things you can be passionate about. And if you're passionate about all of them, how do you have an effect on any of them? We haven't resolved that. There are many activists in the US who are passionately angry at many museums about this, that, or the other thing because they feel they should be doing one of these things. The consensus seems to be it's absolutely appropriate if it's related to your mission. You know, if you're a natural history museum, you shouldn't avoid talking about climate change just because a very rich person on your board runs a company that produces oil. If you're the National Museum of Women in the Arts, you should be passionate about gender inequality because it's directly related to your mission. The harder question is, how much attention do you spend around the effects of how you operate on other important issues? So go back to this question of climate change. You could make a reasonable argument that, you know, maybe I would argue any kind of museum could have a persuasive and influential exhibit about climate change. If you're a history museum, you could talk about how things were different in the past and the historical record that can show it's different from today. If you're an art museum, there are works of art that can document changing climate over time, from what people wear to what was growing. But you could also make a valid argument, that we're the museum of this artist. We're not inherently talking about climate change. We're talking about the specific artist. I think you can make a credible argument, though, that you can't ignore the fact that how you run your museum, how you build your new museum, how you operate the museum, how you invest your money is still having influential effects on what is probably the biggest challenge of our time and of future generations. And it doesn't require huge changes in your operation. It requires changes in your attention and your intention, spending some time thinking about what are the values shaping your plans for a new building and who you're hiring to design it and where you're investing the money. So at least in the US, I would argue that this is a huge issue that people are debating all the time, and the pivot in opinion in opinion tends to be towards recognizing that a certain level of activism is absolutely appropriate related to mission, and at some base level is appropriate regardless of mission, and we're still trying to work out what that base level is.
Thank you.
I think that was a brilliant conclusion to the talk and to our discussion, and I of course hope that we can personally approach you in any occasion during your stay here and continue with individual topics. But now it would be time to have a break.